Toto, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
The stuff that dreams are made of.
Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night.
You're tearing me apart!
He's looking at you, kid.
Well, nobody's perfect.
All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up.
Hello and welcome to Revisiting the Golden Age, a journey through classic Hollywood. I'm Josh Martin, and welcome back to another episode. And today we are dealing with one of the most famous sort of blockbusters of the pre-blockbuster era in classic Hollywood. And joining me to talk about it today is Jake Lawler. Jake, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, sir. How are you?
Doing pretty well, and we were talking before we came on here, and yeah, so the film we're dealing with today is King Kong, the 1933 film directed by Merian C. Cooper and Ernest Schoedstack. I think I've said that right. But it's a very fitting day to be talking about a King Kong movie because we also got a trailer for the latest iteration of King Kong on the big screen, Adam Wingard's Godzilla vs. Kong, which will be coming out in March, I believe. So yeah, that was a fun little coincidence. I know we were talking about our different opinions on what Warner Brothers has deemed the Monsterverse of just their collection of movies about Godzilla and King Kong, basically, maybe more. But what did you think of the trailer? I know we were talking about this a little bit already, but
Oh yeah, I mean it looks awesome. I think it's a very nice return to form after seeing the King of Monsters. I think that it's going to be exactly what monster fans want, exactly what Godzilla fans want. And Pacific Rim is one of my favorite movies. One of my favorite movies of the genre in the past really decade or so. And I think that this reminds me a lot of it in all good ways. So hopefully this is the best iteration of the monster universe trilogy, whatever they're building out. But it looks like a lot of fun. So
yeah, no, it's been a sort of down year for blockbusters, not because they were bad necessarily, but because there just weren't that many of them. On sort of a basic level, I am very excited to see King Kong punch Godzilla in the face and vice versa. Like I was telling Jake before we got on here, I have been burned by too many of the Monsterverse trailers before. I still remember being in gosh, it must have been in middle school or early high school when that first trailer for the Gareth Edwards Godzilla came out, and it was like all moody, and it was set to the track from 2001, and it was incredible. And the movie itself was and then same with I'm not huge on Skull Island either. I like the idea. I was like, oh, they're doing like a riff on Apocalypse Now and an adventure film, and I just kind of found it a little tedious after a while. So but the idea of bringing these two franchises together for sort of I know they've been brought together before, but for a sort of big contemporary blockbuster is definitely very exciting. And I've tended to like Adam Wingard's work. The Guest is a great little horror film, and I even like his version of Death Note. I've never seen or read the anime, so I can't compare, but it sort of has some style and flair, and I agree with you on Pacific Rim. That movie is a lot of fun. So but yeah, so we're going back now with today's episode nearly 88 years. So King Kong, the first version of King Kong, produced by David O. Selznick, the sort of one of the most iconic producers of the Hollywood era, and distributed by Radio Pictures before they became RKO. So King Kong, it's sort of the story that everyone knows. It was remade a couple times, once in the 70s and then once fairly recently with Peter Jackson, at least this sort of iteration of the story. It follows a film director, producer named Carl Denham. I believe he's played by Robert Armstrong. He's a sort of showman and goes to sort of what he would probably deem exotic locales and films pictures there. And he has an idea to go to a remote island and film a picture there. And he's heard a little bit about the legend of King Kong, and so he's interested in following that up. And so that's the sort of basic plot. There's also Fay Ray plays the other lead of the picture. She is his star that he sort of finds on the street. Her name is Ann Darrow. She is just sort of stealing bread for food, and he doesn't have a lead actress for the film, so he gets her. There's a ship captain as well. They go to an island. Then they find out that there's King Kong, and then there's lots of fighting and actually lots more action than I remembered. So I saw this film once years ago, but I think Jake, when we were talking leading up to doing this podcast, I think you said this was your first time watching it, and I was curious what your thoughts were, how your first viewing of this film went, and yeah.
Yeah, no, it was my first time seeing it, and I'm really glad that I did see it, because at first I was like, upon finishing it, I was just astounded by how like really impressive it was. I mean, the fact that it was made in 1933, and they did it with miniatures and like the editing techniques that they did, and like you said, there was a lot more action than I was anticipating. I think we talked about it earlier, but the body count of the film is 40, and
it's a lot, yeah.
But like watching all of that, and it's a masterful, impressive technical achievement by all means, and I think that there's something to be said that it's still, we can watch this knowing it's from 1933 and still be astounded by it. I think sort of like allows it to be as impressive. But of course, I think this was sort of it was like the antithesis of when I watched Freaks, because I remember when I watched Freaks, I was really surprised by the progressive nature of the politics and the handling of like sex and gender relations, and how to treat individuals that are differently abled. And this was not that. I mean, it was staggeringly racist, really sexist. But I don't think it wasn't as racist as it could have been, which I guess, like, congratulations for being not within the nation. But that was sort of like hard to overlook as well. But definitely as like a technical achievement in cinematic history, it should be on the top of the mountain, or at least in contention, because I mean, holy shit,
Yeah, no, absolutely. And on the matter of race, it's definitely, I think certainly, like, even on the ship going to the island, there's a character named Charlie who's a cook, and he's Asian, and just speaks like entirely in like broken English in the most sort of caricature-esque way. And so right from the start, it's extremely problematic. And once they get to the island itself, and the sort of indigenous characters there, black characters, all sort of portrayed not in a positive light at all. I do think the film has, I think it's sort of its reputation in film history has been upheld in spite of that, in part because the film is sort of an interesting text on colonialism and the sort of colonial mindset as well, because and which I think, when I was glancing through the filmographies of the directors, is almost a sort of self-critique, in that here you have this film, and it's a critique in a self-reflexive way. So here you have this film, quite literally about a guy who travels around and sort of documents places that are not his, and with this sort of eye for the other, of like, and not in a positive way, in the way that Hollywood used to sort of do documentaries and jungle pictures, and the sort of exoticism that came with that. But he gets there and he never stops. It's like by the end of it, he's like, oh, let's go drop bombs on King Kong and take him back with us. And so just this continual presence of these characters who are these all white characters. All the white members of the crew end up going to the island, and just basically take over and do what they want. And you could argue there's probably a little bit of critique there, but I fully agree with you in that I think there's enough where you're like, I'm not fully sure they're conscious of, the fact that they almost are making fun of themselves. So it's one of those films that exists in that weird little space in between where there's almost plausible deniability as a self-critique, but also some stuff that you just cannot justify under any terms. But yeah, I had seen this film, gosh, when I was first going through some of the classic films. So this would have been when I was 13 or so years old. And I was definitely really blown away by it at the time. And it remains a sort of wonderfully exciting piece of entertainment. But it also has stretches that, are pretty bland. And the first 20-30 minutes especially are it's tough to give a shit about any of the human characters, just truthfully. I mean, like you said, the body count is very high, but most of the human characters, and I do agree that it's the interesting thing about the sexism in the film is that it starts out and you have Ann Darrow, and she seems like a decently strong-willed character, even going up against the sort of shipmate who she's romantically paired with. But at a certain point, and she has a reputation based on, or Fay Wray, the actress, has a reputation based on pretty much this one film as sort of one of Hollywood's first scream queens. And it's not quite like the final girl films of the 70s and 80s. And, it really is just a lot of screaming and a lot of running around the island. And so, yeah, there's definitely some problems with that. But, we talked about the fact that there's a lot of action and, I mean, it is this film that operates almost in this sort of purely cinematic mode for the middle stretch of it. Very little dialogue, just jumping from, King Kong killing members of the ship crew to King Kong fighting dinosaurs. I remember when I first saw this film, I was shocked by that. I thought that was a invention for the Peter Jackson remake, but nope, there are like tons of dinosaurs on Skull Island, and King Kong is fighting them all the time. But yeah, no, it's a very sort of interesting film. I'm not as fond of it as I was when I was 13, and probably understandably so. I mean, there's probably more nuance to be explored now than back then when I was just sort of looking at things purely in terms of entertainment value, which this film has plenty to offer. But yeah, it's this really sort of complex film, but I fully agree with you, undeniably technologically advanced, and the effects are still sort of impressive and staggering to this day.
Yeah, and I think that's really where how you should view it within the context of film history, like we've been saying. But I it's funny that you mention the stretches where really nothing happens. I mean, it must have been because I remember watching it, felt really sort of disjointed in a way where tonally it was something that it was just, an adventure movie in the beginning, and then it turned into King Kong, and then like it had like a weird switch when they captured King Kong, and then it turned into like sort of like an old celebration of Hollywood and romance and different things like that. And then it went right back. And I think the tonal shifts were a little bit hard to, it just felt really disjointed in that way. But still, I mean, the fact that we were able to see what must have been like a 20-30 minute sequence of King Kong on the island, and then the last like 20-15 minute sequence of him in New York was all pretty astounding. And then I remember being able to watch the T-Rex fight, and I was like, wow, this is going on for like a really long time.
Yeah.
But it looked really good, and there's moments of real palpable tension in there when one of the I think the lead shipmate, I forget his name, he's underneath and King Kong, he's underneath like a part of like the part of the island, and King Kong's like rummaging around in the cavern that he's in. And then once King Kong's hand leaves, the huge centipedes come up and try to like eat him as well. So I can only imagine what what it must have felt like to be like in a theater watching that for the first time, because I can't imagine that anyone else had done anything prior to that.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I definitely think that we've talked a little bit about the sort of long and rather sort of bland stretches of the first 30 minutes, and for in one way it seems like it's establishing human drama that we don't really care about. I mean, it because towards the end, we talked about the sort of the downtime here, but it also is a sort of very fast-paced film that almost seems to skip stretches of. I mean, when Peter Jackson remade it, he stretched it out to over 3 hours, and here it's an hour and 40 minutes. I mean, it's very sort of rapid from the moment they capture King Kong on the island, and then we're back, and then it's premiere night in New York, and then the airplanes, and then everything else, and the movie just kind of ends. But the first 30 40 minutes, there is a really good sort of sense of anticipation and excitement built around, okay, when are we going to see King Kong? When is he going to show up? And there's this sort of clever game where we get sort of glimpses of the character, and he's a sort of really, like we've said, an impressive sort of feat of film technology and special effects. But I did sort of enjoy some of the atmospheric tension on display, especially when they get close to the island and there's this sort of foggy, dense atmosphere that sort of teases something, something spectacular that's going to happen. And that's a strategy that's been, deployed in every great horror movie, probably from, Spielberg's Jaws sort of hides the shark for long periods of time. Alien does the same thing. So it's really interesting to see that sort of start here as a trope of the horror adventure film. But yeah, I agree with you that it's sort of a disjointed film at times. Not every. I used to think when I was really started just getting into exploring film history that every sort of early example of the post-silent era, so any films in the late 20s or early 30s that were talkies, had sort of this awkward pacing where there wasn't really music in the background, and that's not it at all. There's just some films just have this sort of awkward lumbering pace to them, and it's the characters themselves. I'm not a huge fan of Robert Armstrong's performance in the film as Carl Denham. It's very sort of showman-y, and that's perfect for the character, but it's a little annoying at times. And so definitely the film's highlight is that stretch. Like you said, there's just some spectacular moments of like that dinosaur fight is really gruesome too. I was shocked by that even today, of like, it is like he basically, like, we're so used to seeing CGI monsters rip each other to shreds, and that's good for what it is, but there is something still sort of like viscerally violent of when he tears that T-Rex's like jaws apart and there's like blood dripping out of it.
Yeah.
It's not terribly disturbing, but it's compared to the sort of, I don't know, lifeless CGI that we get today. I'm not saying that I haven't been like, oh, that was pretty cool during like a monster fight in one of the contemporary films, but there is something about that sort of tactile quality to the visual effects that makes a substantial difference.
Yeah, and I think that this feels like one of the first iterations of kind of like the Night of the Living Dead effect. Because I remember watching the Night of the Living Dead and then looking it up, because again I was watching it and that came out in '68, and it, the amount of like the makeup looked really good, and it was particularly violent for a film that came out then. But to be able to watch that and see that entire thing unfold on screen, and then I remember looking it up, and they said like this was before they had the rating system in place, and they premiered Night of the Living Dead as a Sunday matinee, and for him to be like they said, people like brought their 9-year-olds along, and they were like terrified of the entire thing, and I have to believe that that was the same thing that happened with this in some capacity. But like I think we talked about this earlier, you can also see why it made 5 million. I know they had to re-release it, so it initially came out, and then I think FDR did the bank holidays like the weekend after to kind of combat the Great Depression. So I think the initial weekend it made its budget back, and then they re-released it. I can't remember when, but they re-released it I think maybe a few years later, and that's where the money came in. But I think it really is a testament to what can be done when there is that sort of scrappy filmmaking, because now I was rewatching Transformers, the first Transformers, a while ago, and I was like shocked about how well it looked and how much better it looked than some CGI movies that we see now. And I think because that CGI and special effects have gotten to a point where people have become lenient on it and are only doing like fix it in post and filming it on a green screen rather than building out the models and doing the different things necessary to make it look real and make it look authentic and unique. And that's one of the things that I think that this film serves as a testament to the creators behind it. But at the same time, I think that, the aspect of the racism, it's hard to swallow at times, especially when what I noticed is that all of the white characters that die very far off screen, like very far in the background. You see like King Kong stepping on one from maybe like 100 feet away, and or when they're all falling into the cavern, you never see it actually happening. But all the black characters die really close up, and I was like, this is interesting.
Yeah, no, that is a phenomenal point, and I definitely the sort of racial dynamic there is one that I'm really glad you brought up, because more than anything, I was struck by, we talk a lot about different films today, and what was what was it? Jurassic World. Remember that one where they had like a really violent death for one character, and it became like a sort of internet touchstone for a moment where people were like, did she really deserve that? And it's like, so that sort of inherent cruelty in the genre is something that can be traced back all the way to something like this. But it was a sort of very particular, and I know people, with the Jurassic World one, you could say it's a very sort of gendered violence, and that would absolutely probably be true. But in this case, you're right. Those close-ups of the black characters being sort of just viciously stepped on by King Kong as he sort of rummages about the island, and compared to, like you said, these sort of with the white characters, it's a sort of long shot, and they're sort of falling, and it's very clearly just a dummy that they're throwing down there, whereas this has a sort of a really violent charge to it, and it but at the same time it's sort of to a 1930s audience, it's sort of packaged as this sort of spectacle because of who is the target of the violence. And I think that is something that is particularly sort of hard to stomach about that film, or about the film in that way. But yeah, I like the Night of the Living Dead comparison too, because I think that's a film that, I would say definitely different production modes. King Kong was a sort of big budget production. Night of the Living Dead was, Romero definitely flying by the seat of his pants. But yeah, no, I mean, and I think they're both interesting texts as sort of ways in which horror can induce social panic in a way. I mean, definitely when you said that sort of 9-year-old seeing Night of the Living Dead, I think there's a Roger Ebert review at the time where he was like, "Oh my gosh, this is so violent. We must not let the children see that." And it's so funny. And I think Jonathan Rosenbaum and Jay Hoberman write about it in their Midnight Movies book, that there was this sort of moral panic around that movie. But it's also, we just talked about this sort of very stark difference in the sort of targets of the violence, the depiction of the violence along racial lines. If I remember correctly, though, and I don't necessarily remember where I heard this, but it's always been something that I've sort of known. It's possibly came from Ebert, possibly from other sources in the film. But if I remember, the big moral outrage with King Kong was the material, the scenes where he is like peeling clothes off Fay Ray. I think that was like the moral panic for audiences of 1933. It was like, oh my gosh, this sort of abrupt sexual content cannot stand in today's society, which I think is so funny. I mean, you would think the scene would be like so much more scandalous. If anything, he's more protective of her than the actual Driscoll or Denham or any of them. I mean, so that sort of dynamic is at the heart of the film, and King Kong is definitely a sympathetic character, sort of, and I think that's something that sort of I can't quite square about the ending, is that there is this sort of shift in perspective to where we only really care about him, and then the rest of the characters are just kind of around, and the movie does kind of just end. It ends on one of the most famous lines in film history, and it's a wonderful line, but it's a very sort of interesting shift.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned the moral panic from King Kong, because I think it speaks and serves as to the broader kind of problem and the societal problem that we've had, where we view sex as taboo through entertainment. I know that we've had multiple discussions in our conversations regarding like how people think that sex is unnecessary in film, and like sexual intimacy is unnecessary in film, and even when Don't Look Now was one of the great moments where people were like, no, we can't allow this anymore. And I think that this was really one of the first iterations of that. But I do think that for those that would be interested in watching, I do think that watching this and then watching Night of the Living Dead as a double feature would be a really interesting experience, because I do think that they tackle racism in completely different ways, where one is like very much racist in its origin, where Night of the Living Dead is much more openly against racism, and you don't necessarily get a sense of that until like the last 5 minutes of the film, because what you're watching in Night of the Living Dead the whole time is like a strong black hero basically ordering and slapping all these white people around, and no one's bringing up race whatsoever. And watching it retroactively, you're like, when is this going to come? And then ultimately he survives the night for only a moment until he's killed by law enforcement. And I think that serves as sort of a broader spectrum. And I think that being able to sort of like understand how far film has come and how different films and sort of like the same genre, or at least genre tangentially, allow like work through these different or like kind of work and operate through these different lenses of dealing and tackling with race as a construct.
Yeah, absolutely. And that ending montage in Night of the Living Dead gets me every time, because it's Romero puts the images of, so Dwayne Jones plays Ben in that film, and he's the black hero who's the lead, and like you said, sort of ordering the white people around, and it's clear that there's some racial tensions that aren't fully acknowledged. And then after he's killed, Romero ends with this montage of still photographs that are sort of meant to evoke the imagery of sort of racial violence in the 1960s, and it's images of the cops with his dead body and stuff like that, and definitely a very sort of stark acknowledgement of what the film was about all along, and that's really sort of critical. And yeah, I would highly recommend Night of the Living Dead too. It's a phenomenal film. And but yeah, with the sort of talking about the moral panic around sexuality in the movies, and definitely King Kong comes at an interesting point in that 1933 is, I believe, when the code as it's known starts sort of emerging into place, and it's and yeah, I mean, it's very much targeted against sexuality and stuff like that. That is sort of the key, more than violence. Obviously language is restricted and violence is restricted as well. The code spared nothing, but sex did seem to be a critical sort of aspect of that. But the thing with this is sort of tangential to King Kong, but it's all related to everything that this podcast sort of discusses. Where I get really pissed off, frankly, at the contemporary discourse about sex and the movies, is that because it comes from people who have no I can't claim to know everything about film history, not even close, but a lot of the arguments where people try to argue for a more sexless cinema, a lot of that comes from people who don't know their history. So I've seen people all the time, and they'll bring up, well, we survived without any sex scenes in movies for the entire length of the code and throughout history. It's like we don't really need them now. It's like we movies didn't used to, but like then all that person has told me right then and there is that they've never watched a movie before 1968, because even in ways that without sort of explicit depictions that sort of came from the liberation of the code, and Don't Look Now would be definitely one of those films that was a 1973 film and was sort of liberated by the ability to deal with sex in a more frank way and sort of depict that on screen. And it is, I mean, our friend Johnny Sobchak would definitely bring that up as one of the films that's, anybody who tries to say, oh, a sex scene has never been essential has never seen that movie. I mean, but the idea that films pre-1968 were somehow devoid of sort of sexual content, sexual innuendo, is so completely wrong-headed. I guess maybe it didn't make people, for whatever reason, I guess American audiences are particularly uncomfortable with seeing sex on screen. But I mean, try watching, anything from one of the early Ernst Lubitsch films to anything by Alfred Hitchcock, and it's like the idea that mainstream cinema back then used to be more just as sexless as it is now is just so not true. Today there's no innuendo, there's no playfulness, there's no need to sort of work around it. There's just today there's just nothing. I mean, Marvel films are, and it goes back to Disney and it goes back to Marvel and all that, but that discourse rears its head on Twitter every once in a while, and it never gets any less insufferable. And we've definitely, you, me, Johnny, and Zach and Connor have had plenty of conversations about how sort of stupid that whole thing is. But yeah, I think it's a great, sex has been the centerpiece of America's moral panic about content in films for ages, and it does not seem likely to change anytime soon.
And even talking about this, I mean, even looking at it through the same film that we're talking about in King Kong, I mean, what matters is that white skin is protected, but the villager, the islander that lives on Skull Island, that is like offered up as the first tribute before it's Fay Ray, is like completely naked, and all she's wearing is like a lei and flowers to cover her genitalia.
Yep.
So it's just hilarious that people were like up in arms about, and especially after seeing 40 people get murdered on screen, which I guarantee did not happen prior to, at least in the way that it was depicted, did not happen prior to this film. But even like 40 minutes before King Kong is like tucking or like touching Fay Ray's clothes, you have a fully naked woman that's only covered by leis and flowers, but the difference is that she's black, so it doesn't matter as much.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's like the sort of phenomenon of like I guess like in middle school we would have like National Geographic magazines in classrooms, and it would pictures in countries all over the world, and there would be nudity in there, and that was fine. But the moment anybody anything in a film, it would be like a huge controversy. So you're absolutely right. There's once again sort of a racial dynamic in play there, and yeah, I mean, I think regardless of it is sort of a starkly racist film at times, but it's also, like you said, a really revealing document on these sort of characters viewed as colonizers, in a way, of people who come to a place, they get the villagers killed, which the film depicts as spectacle. So the idea that it is sort of cognizant of its own critique is, a little bit of a stretch in my view at times. But, and then they take, they take King Kong from his home, they put him on display, and then they kill him when he tries to fight back. I mean, so it's this whole sort of yeah, I mean, it's very interesting and illuminating as to Denham as a character, and possibly the filmmakers, because I was looking through the so Merian C. Cooper is probably best known for producing a series of films with John Ford. Schoedstack, though, like looking through his filmography, it's like there was one in like 1927 which he directed again with Cooper, and it was like Chang, a drama of the wilderness, and it's like elephants in northern Siam. So it's once again, it's like they're reflecting their own history and sort of giving us a document of how that mindset was of going to places and sort of appropriating that culture within this sort of context of a Hollywood picture, which is, the entire thing has, raises so many flags as problematic, but it also remains this sort of really fascinating way of looking at how Hollywood depicted race in the early 30s. And especially, like you said earlier, definitely a very sort of different counterpoint to a film like Freaks, which even today you can go, wow, Hollywood hasn't really matched that level of representation that film offered. With King Kong, very, very different story.
Yeah. And, I think that what's even harder to sort of like grapple, I guess, or reckon with this film is that it's just there is a bit of a complexity, and there's a sort of there's a sort of progressive nature of ideals in there, like we've been talking about, because watching it and understanding that it is both deeply racist, but also deeply critical of people messing with other cultures that aren't American. Because watching it, none of their like exploits or their escapades or anything that they do on the island, and even coming back when King Kong gets loose and starts destroying New York City, none of that is really depicted in like a celebratory manner. All of it is like, this is what happens when you mess with these different things, but also at the same sense is that you're watching it and it almost feels like it's saying you shouldn't go to these places because this is going to happen to you, or because it's dangerous. But if you do go to these places, it's okay because we're dominant and we will be able to sort of clean up your mess. So it's kind of like indicting itself, which in turn is indicting. It's just like it's like it's in a loop of trying to say something, but it's being drowned out by the poor handling of everything else.
Yeah, and even the idea of because the film, one of the more famous sequences in film history, King Kong climbs the Empire State Building with Ann Darrow in hand. He sets her down. He seems to realize there is a sort of kinship there between the two of them, in part because, like you said, there is a sexist element to the film, but once again there's another sort of complication in within the film itself, because there seems to be a recognition that Denham is putting her unnecessarily in harm's way at every turn. I mean, she probably shouldn't have gone. I mean, yes, there's a point where she goes, "Oh, I really want to go to the island," but he just sort of grabs her, puts her on a boat, and uses her for his own sort of project and his own aims. So she's a victim of his exploitation too. So there is this sort of kinship between Kong and Darrow. I think along those lines, the film sort of just goes, oh well, he's really attracted to her and whatever, and that is what it is. But definitely up until the last moment, King Kong gets shot down, eventually falls to the ground, and Denham utters the famous line, and he goes, "No, it wasn't the airplanes, it was beauty killed the beast." And it's like, no, I mean, you did. You brought him to New York City and then shot him when when you tried to mess with nature. So, it's a very sort of fascinating way in which the film is showing us one thing that we can sort of interpret within our own sort of contemporary framework, but also telling us something else entirely. And so, the film really ends right there. They made a sequel that was called Son of Kong. It came out literally later that year. They just sort of made it very quickly. But yeah, no, I mean, there's really no like explanation of what happens to does Fay Ray and the captain guy, whatever his name is, I can't remember, Driscoll, do they stay together? What happens to Denham? Does he get in trouble for his giant attraction, destroying buildings and possibly killing people? It just kind of ends right there. But I do think that there is sort of it definitely makes King Kong a sympathetic character. And it definitely, despite the fact that, like you've said, he is the sort of um, person who's responsible for killing several people on the island in this viciously violent way. But then we can walk that back and say that, well, by proxy, Denham is really at fault here for sort of sparking the events of the whole thing. So, like you said, it's this sort of complex, contradictory film. That is probably it's certainly worth talking about, but also best sort of enjoyed within the context of its effects, of its spectacle, but not without a critical eye towards what that spectacle is and who sort of its victims are at every turn.
Yeah, and I do think that it is something I'm glad I watched, and I think that anyone who hasn't seen it that is interested in the historical nature of films like this and how they sort of came about, especially probably now is as good a time as any to sort of go back with the newest arrival coming soon in the franchise. I think it would be an interesting exercise, as it was for me, to be able to look at it with 2021 eyes and understand that despite the staggering amounts of racism that are prevalent without the film, it remains a technical achievement, and one of the finest and one of the most impressive films I've seen in recent memory that was able to sort of operate within the confines of the technology it was given and create something pretty spectacular.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree. And it's definitely a film where you can certainly see the seams in the technology. Sometimes it's very clear that, there's two planes of action going on, or there was sort of one place of a miniature and one place a normal set. But that doesn't make it any less staggering, and certainly a very fun film to watch at times, with sort of an eye towards the fact that there's very little dialogue. And just this sort of continual rumble of action. But yeah, it's certainly one that it's always fun to go back and watch some films at a young age and then revisit them later. It's certainly a film that's dropped in my estimation a little bit as sort of like one of my as a film that I would consider one of my favorites of the classical Hollywood era. I certainly wouldn't consider this one at this point, but a really fascinating film nonetheless, and one that's absolutely worth checking out. So, and yeah, one that's a lot of a very interesting film to talk about. So, so thanks for coming on to talk about this film, Jake, and yeah, anything, and listeners can follow you on Twitter and any other projects or stuff coming up.
Yeah, we are finishing up the sound mixing on our short film now, so we should have a final cut ready within the next 10 days or so, and then we'll get a release date going, and then we'll move forward from there. But we're definitely very excited to release that. It's something that was well received at Film Fest 919, and I'm excited for not only you and Johnny to see it, but also the rest of the audience as well. And then after that, there is some news that I can't disclose yet, but I've already told you and Johnny and that I'll be able to share when it comes out. But I'm excited for that as well. So
awesome! No, I'm really looking forward to seeing the short film, and yeah, so you could follow me on Twitter and Letterboxd at Martin on Movies. Follow Inside the Film Room on Twitter and other social media as well. And I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you next time.